All right, welcome back to the Crimson Flag podcast, where we bring you a class-conscious analysis of historic and current events which are pertinent to the international working class movement. My name is FBK, and I am joined today by comrades Danky Kang and Connor Gillis. How are you doing today, comrades?
Doing pretty good.
Awesome. Yeah, we're glad to have our friend Connor here finally. Yeah, she has a great YouTube channel. Since this show is going to be blasted out to Spotify and everywhere else, we'll give her channel a good shout out here. So definitely listen to her content. She's got some good historical dives and stuff like that. So definitely a lot you can learn there. Yeah, so today we decided we were going to talk about a subject that is not really on the top of a lot of people's lists, and that is going to be the counter-revolution that happened in Romania in 1989. So yeah, as a lot of people know, there was quite a lot going on in 1989, but this is one of those events that tends to be overshadowed. So we're going to talk about it, and we're going to get some reactions from our comrades here. So I'll begin here. So yeah, in 1989, we witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall, massive protests in Tiananmen Square, and movements throughout the Eastern Bloc that threatened socialism in those countries. Consistently overshadowed is the counter-revolution that occurred in Romania that same year. This is largely due to the fact that the events in 1989 are largely characterized as non-violent pro-democracy movements who initiated revolutionary change without the utilization of physical violence. The events in Romania, however, cannot be described as such. It would see its leader and his wife, Nicolae Ceausescu and Elena Ceausescu, executed. It would also see confrontations between rogue military units and protesters, and international media manipulation, which inflamed and justified the brutal fashion in which the socialist government came to its end. At the same time, many of the events were thoroughly documented on film. It was heralded as the first revolution to be televised, implying an accessibility on the public's part to assess what was occurring. Despite this apparent capturing of certain major events of the counter-revolution, almost 30 years later, we see that Romanian courts are still battling it out in an attempt to discover what truly happened in that year. As you'll soon see, the events are still shrouded in mystery. Luckily, to the credit of concerned Romanians and principled journalists, there has been significant discoveries which blatantly run in the face of the imperialist narrative regarding that counter-revolution. So to start off here, we will begin with just a brief history of how socialism came to be in Romania, and it's a story that is similar to a lot of the other Eastern European countries. So it began when Prime Minister Ion Antonescu was overthrown in August of 1944. And he was a fascist collaborator. And in fact, Romanians at the time were actually fighting alongside the Nazis. So even in Stalingrad, the Nazis were being assisted by Romanian troops at the time. So his overthrow was very significant. And by 1946, the communist-led bloc of democratic parties won a majority of elected positions. The next year, in 1947, the king was urged by the leader of the government, who was backed by an army of communists, to abdicate power. And hours later, Parliament would officially dissolve the monarchy and declare Romania a people's republic. And they were the last monarchy to be overthrown in the Eastern Bloc. And yeah, finally, in 1948, the Communist Party and the Social Democratic parties merged to form the Romanian Workers' Party, and they were the ruling party. And the same year, we would also see the nationalization of banks and industry. So yeah, I wanted to get your perspective, Connor. If you can just tell the audience what exactly characterizes a people's democracy, since we see so many of those popping up in Europe throughout that time.
Yeah. You'll notice, actually, there's a very specific that they'll call it the People's Republic in a lot of these places, and some of these countries were the PRL, the Polish People's Republic, Romania, Germany was one of these, though it wasn't. It was called the German Democratic Republic, but so what it was was after the war, many of these places had elections, and many of these elections were under a united front, which was the policy of the Comintern at that point in the war, with the communists leading this front of social democrats, socialists, liberals, even just generally pro-democratic people fighting against fascism. And these fronts won elections all across in Czechoslovakia and East Germany, and it led to even many times the mergers of some of these parties that weren't necessarily ideologically the same. Like in Germany, the Socialist Unity Party was the merger of the Communist Party, the Eastern section of the Communist Party, and the Eastern section of the German Social Democratic Party. In Hungary, the Hungarian Workers' Party was the same. In Poland, the United Socialist Workers' Party was the same. It was a union. And we see the same thing happen here in Romania. You see the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party unite to form a workers' party under a people's democracy, which isn't a single party state necessarily. It's sort of a united front sort of affair, national front sort of affair.
Right. I think that is a great explanation. I think that's a good way to put it is it's almost a product of the United Front strategy that was being implemented at the time. So, yeah, to go on from there, the leader of the country at that time, it would be Georgy Dej, and he would be the leader for about a decade or so. Although he was previously an apparent supporter of Stalin, he broke with him after Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956. A period of de-Stalinization was then implemented. Factories, parks, and streets were renamed after historic national heroes. Party members who objected to the policy were literally purged. Also, at the same time, Khrushchev, he stated that Romania could be the breadbasket of the more industrial advanced Eastern Bloc countries. George Dej, on the other hand, was still hoping to follow the classic premise of rapid industrialization. Realizing he was at an impasse, Dej would go on to seek out closer relations with China and even the United States. This would be the beginning of a rift between Romania and the USSR, which would shape much of its future.
So I think this is pretty interesting because you can sort of see in Romania under Dej this sort of ultra leftist turn. And I think a lot of countries were facing this. So it seems like there were really two routes that most countries were going post-revolution. You could either go this more ultra leftist route, or you could go along the lines of a people's democracy.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because at the time, so he, like I said, he was an interesting character because on one hand, he wanted to follow like the premises of like what Stalin was, how he was wanting to build socialism, but he also was breaking away from Khrushchev. You know, it is hard to characterize because at the same time, he was building relationships with like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And so, you know, this is when he starts to build what we would call national communism. So he's taking in these different influences. And, you know, it is interesting because I will say, okay, so yeah, right after that, after the de-Stalinization program, they would also do like a de-Russification program. So they would go as far to like, you know, they were doing more of taking Russian names out of schools and such and replacing it with other national heroes. So as they were taking out that Soviet influence, they were replacing it with influences from even the Cultural Revolution in China, but also seeking out ties with the West. So it's, in my opinion, it is kind of hard to characterize what path they were exactly trying to take, except for like their own kind of route.
Yeah, and I think that that's interesting to go further back, as we know what were the causes for de-Russification outside of just, you know, a typical ideological split? Like, why do you think that a lot of these countries decided that they had their own national peculiarities and characteristics that were being stifled by the Soviet Union? Because the Soviet Union, while a good and positive force of history and an imperialist country, had undue influence amongst all of these countries, and Romania felt it pretty hard. We have to remember that there's a part of Romania called Moldova, or part of Russia called, or the Soviet Union, the Moldovan SSR, that has a majority Romanian, population, and you can see that they're thinking to themselves, "Look at they've lost all the Romanian culture. They're being dominated by Moscow. Maybe we should go our own way, our third way." Is it right? I'm not sure if it's all bad or all wrong, but it's certainly something we can understand.
Right. I know we talked about this a little before the stream, but one way I think I might characterize it is, in one hand, they were forced into a position to take their own route. It was clear that they couldn't, not even just because of these ideological differences with Khrushchev, but as you're mentioning, there's deeper kind of issues as far as how to treat national peculiarities and such. And so even if Romania chose a path that wasn't the correct one, I think we can see why they started on a new path. So in the middle of all this, George Dej, he would die. And his successor would be longtime party member Nicolae Ceausescu, who would run the country up until the government's downfall in '89. And he would continue this de-Russification, and it was very popular. By all accounts, this was very popular in Romania at the time. Yeah, after that, this would have been about like the mid 60s, they actually reached out to the International Monetary Fund and started having talks with them. So it wouldn't be until the 70s that they would actually take on loans, though. So let me see here. So talking a little bit about Romania's path, another reason that the lessons of the Romanian counter-revolution remain overshadowed is due to the route that socialist Romania took. The name Nicolae Ceausescu, I can't say that. The name Nicolae Ceausescu is rarely mentioned in a positive light, even amongst communists. So we talked a little bit about national communism. I kind of briefly mentioned this, but some people will talk about there could be like a little bit of a Juche link. We know that Juche does have this focus on the national peculiarities of Korea in particular. And Ceausescu was reaching out to the DPRK a lot at the time. So that could have been an early influence for maybe why he took this route, or, where to take some influence from. But just a couple other things that characterize the 1960s. So in 1968, we saw, the events in Czechoslovakia where Soviet troops intervened. And during this event, Nicolae Ceausescu, he would actually condemn the Soviet Union. And it was at this time that Western media, they started referring to him as the Maverick. That became his nickname, implying that he is even not afraid to stand up to the Soviet Union despite being a socialist. Yeah, so the IMF trouble, that would actually come to, let's see, in 1981, approximately $13 billion worth of debt was actually built up in Romania. And this became a massive problem. So at that point in 1981, they decided that they would implement a policy of austerity where they would reduce social spending, they would reduce public consumption in hopes that they could just pay off these debts. And it was actually in 1987, they did say that they would never take any IMF loans again. So we see there where they decided to go down the structural adjustment route, which is very interesting. We don't see that. Honestly, I can't think of another socialist country who has gone down that road, unless either of y'all do. So that did come to a head, and we saw massive problems with that later on.
Yeah,
but I wonder. Yeah, go for it.
I want to point out that when these loans started getting really bad, as you said, 1981. What happened in 1981 in the United States? Who got elected president?
Reagan, right?
Yeah, Reagan. And just a couple years in '79 before that in the UK, who got elected? Maggie Thatcher. Mm-hmm. This was the rise of the age of neoliberalism. This was the decline of the Soviet Union. and the rise of the age of neoliberalism. And at the time, the IMF, like we discussed before the recording, the IMF was a very new thing. And for countries trying to go their own route that feel like, oh, we can't be taken advantage of, we have this strong national system. And, it's nefarious. And look what they had to do, implement austerity. That is a key tenet of neoliberalism, austerity, budget adjustments, opening up for international capital. That's what it's all about. And it coincides exactly with what's happening in Romania when they opened the door. Like they still had a chance to turn back, but when they opened the door, the loan, that's whenever the parasites of imperialism were there, and you can't remove them. They're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So my big question is, what would possess them to even take on these IMF loans? And then why were they in so much debt to begin with?
I believe the debt didn't start building until they took on the IMF loans. As far as speculating on why they took them on, I think Connor did make a good point that, they were talking to the IMF in the 60s. So this would have been a relatively new thing at the time. And especially since like the age of like the structural adjustment policies, when I think of it, I think of the 80s and such. We do see that it was right when it was becoming a really recognized phenomenon, was right when Romania was trying to get out of it. So I think that is a good point, that it was the same year, 1981, where they realized the hole that they were beginning to bury themselves in. So as far as why they took it on, obviously, we would expect a socialist country to be skeptical of taking loans from the Western nations. But I think maybe they just thought they didn't have a historical precedent of how damaging these things could be. But that may be giving them too much credit for all I know.
May I say they might have also actually genuinely believed that their national system was strong enough to take these loans, increase their production, exponentially, and be able to pay them back without having to be austere. So, but unfortunately, they didn't expect the 80s to happen. They didn't expect the decline of the Soviet Union to happen. They didn't expect the IMF to be so nefarious, And the IMF literally takes away country sovereignty, and that's the trap, that debt trap that they put countries in. Once they have you in that trap, like they have full control to tell you what to do with on international law, what to do with your budget. And the countries that have broken away from these loans without paying them back, like Venezuela, for example, they said, fuck your IMF loans. We're going to do this our own way. And that's really the only way you can get out of it. And, that could have been one way to get out of that in the end. But, by 87, we all know the tides were turning by then. The seeds have been planted. Counter-revolution is in the air.
Yeah, definitely. The damage was definitely done. And you mentioned the slow decline of the Soviet Union. That was very important at the time as well. I honestly wish I had more information on this, but we've talked a little bit about how there has been tension this whole time between Romania and the USSR. Well, by the time of Gorbachev coming into power, that only starts to get even more tense, which is interesting, I think, because we see Romania, they're taking on these IMF loans, but they're still kind of battling the overly liberal elements in the Soviet Union. But for example, Ceausescu, he publicly made it known that he was opposed to perestroika and glasnost. Now, I know that the relations between the two leaders was definitely not positive. Some would, there actually was a quote. Sam Marcy wrote this in an article that I read, where he was quoting, I believe somebody in the New York Times, but somebody in the New York Times said, the United States should support if the Soviet Union invaded Romania. It's kind of a very random thing to say, but it was showing that there was this kind of tension at the time where we saw, as Romania was declining, near the later part of the 80s, Gorbachev was definitely not too sad about it, to say the least. Although I don't want to imply that he may have been involved. Some will go down that route, but I would say we don't really have significant evidence to show whether that's true or not. But on that
what
note,
we can say for a fact is that Gorbachev was one of the main figures in bringing down socialism across the Eastern Europe. I mean, he illegally dissolved the Soviet Union against a referendum, and so it was nefarious from the beginning. You know,
right, and it shows he probably wouldn't lift a finger as Romania was struggling and such. But that's definitely like something we need to look a little more into to shed more light on. But yeah, so now we're going to talk about the counter-revolution that happened in 1989. So actually in 1989, Romania, miraculously, they paid off their loans 100%, which it's very rare. You don't really see it that much historically. And so that was a big feat for the government to reach that point. So there might have been high spirits in the beginning of 1989 that things might be starting to turn around. As we know, there was a lot of international activity as far as like liberalism spreading to these different socialist countries. So that atmosphere, plus the damage that was already done, really just kind of had everything just ready to go. And so where things would actually kick off, though, was in a northern part of Romania that is called Timișoara. And it began with a man named Laszlo Tokes. And this man, Laszlo Tokes, he was a popular pastor, and he was known for making critical statements against the government. And in 1989, he was actually scheduled for a deportation. And when word of this spread, protesters actually formed a human chain around his house, preventing police from doing the deportation. And the movement turned into a larger thing as people just started to sporadically join. And sure enough, it turns into an all-out protest, and where they're actually like trying to burn down police buildings. And in these early protests, we do know that there was shooting. We don't know the extent of it exactly, but I will say that these protests, they did start to extend to the rest of the country. And this would have been in December of 1989. Okay, yeah, and a large part of why the protests were able to spread to the rest of the country was, of course, Radio Free Europe. They were able to get a hold of this narrative, and they were spreading it around the country. And, there was enough built up resentment against the government. I mean, we can see different reasons why people would have frustrations after facing like 9 years of austerity and such. So I think it was easily like able to be co-opted by people who had ulterior motives and such. So it actually came to a head in on December 22nd of that year. And Nicolae Ceausescu, he addressed the people from the Central Committee building in an effort to condemn the opposition movement that was growing. He blamed foreign influences, and he even blamed the Soviet Union as one of the reasons why he felt like this was happening. So an interesting thing that happened during this speech that he was giving, and it was given to a mass amount of people. There's a video of this. I'll post it in the description. He's giving a speech to a mass amount of people. And in the middle of the speech, he begins, he just stops, and you can hear a commotion in the crowd. And for years, it wasn't really known what happened. All we see is that he's speaking, he stops, we hear a commotion, and the camera's cut off. Eventually, we know that because of this commotion, he was flown away from the building and taken to a secure location. One thing that I have to add is that years later, I think earlier in the podcast, I mentioned that Romanian courts are still trying to figure out what exactly happened. So in 2017, one of the prosecutors in the case revealed that the Romanian military had purchased equipment in 1987 that could replicate the sound of gunfire and the sound of troops being parachuted in. And the claim is that they were using this equipment and they staged it in a building. And that was what caused the disruption, because these people thought they were being fired upon. In the video, you can actually hear somebody saying, "Who's shooting?" And nobody was actually shot at that particular event. So it looks like, by most accounts, there was some type of element in the military who was able to get a hold of this equipment and cause a disruption that caused Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife to flee to what they thought was a secure location. Okay, so yeah, as they're flying Nicolae Ceausescu out, there was battles that began to happen in the streets. And, you know, this has been one of the biggest questions of the entire thing, is who was shooting? Because there's two different elements here. On one hand, we have the Romanian military, and we also have what is called the Securitate. And that is more like the party's elite police security force, in a sense. So the claim is that there was fighting between the army, who turned on Ceausescu, and the Securitate, who are supposedly still in favor of him. And a lot of the shooting that would have occurred, like the days following that, they would say that it was between these two forces, and that it was like Ceausescu's police who were trying to murder all these people. We really don't know like who was on which side still. So that honestly is still one of the mysteries. But as far as Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, I mentioned that they were flown to a secure location. It actually wasn't. They were actually turned in. And sure enough, there was a new government that was starting to form. And this new government was starting to form out of elements of the former of the Communist Party. So there were certain like dissidents or liberalizers in the party who decided, okay, we're going to be with the new government. Well, they formed a court, and they decided that we're basically going to try Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu and pretty much execute them. They pretty much decided it before. And so they capture them. They come in. They actually found him. He was running away. He was hiding in a tank by the time they got to him. And, you know, this trial, it's actually, you can watch it on YouTube. Most of it is actually recorded. His attitude is very much that he just keeps saying that he doesn't recognize the court, that if he's going to face a court, it's going to be the legitimate, you know, recognized one of Romania, and that theirs didn't really matter to him. Well, of course, they go through the trial and everything, and they let him know that him and his wife are going to be executed. And, you know, this is very significant because we don't really see this happening in any of the other countries where socialism, you know, fell. And sure enough, you know, they lead him out of the room. The couple decided they wanted to be executed together. And it is reported that Nicolae Ceausescu, he was singing the International as he was led to his death.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
I think that the worst that should have happened to Ceausescu is that he was removed from office for being incompetent. But to kill in such a brutal way, and the court wasn't legitimate. Do you think the people of Romania even had any idea what that court was? No.
Right. Yeah. That's the big thing. And that's what's left a lot of questions for all these years, because you'll see videos of many people who are happy about it. But there was especially, I read an article from a person from Romania who was a child at the time. And one thing that I should have mentioned is that this actually occurred on Christmas of 1989. So this was the 25th. And this was being broadcast to everybody on Romania at that time. So this guy's, he wrote this great article where he just said, it was very hard to explain to children. It was very traumatic in a way because we didn't understand what was going on and why it was being broadcast so openly, you know, the day of, which is very, I mean, it is very callous. And actually in Romania, I believe still, I've read accounts where they will still on Christmas, they'll play the video like on the news, and it's kind of, they treat it as, this was a great event because now we can finally celebrate Christmas again. That's the way
I just want to point out that Romanians are Orthodox and their Christmas is usually January, mid-January.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if that's just like a little bit for the Western news to,
Yeah, it's to
like.
give people a date context, but still, the fact that they play it, I mean, I think it's the holiday season. First of all, the New Year's coming up, and second of all, the fact that they play it, on the news every year, there's something morbid about that. There's something really disgusting about that.
It just shows how screwed up neoliberalism is. They try to present it as, the Walmart logo with the smiley face, and it's all sunshine and rainbows, and it's all just a pro-democracy movement. But underneath all of that veneer, it's a very vicious implementation of foreign-sponsored overthrow of a people's government. It's tragic. It was horrible. And then the people who live in the former Eastern Bloc are absolutely miserable.
Right. Yeah. And, there's two more elements of this that I think we should discuss before we get out of here. I know we mentioned a little bit before that the military was involved, and I definitely want to get y'all's reaction to this part right here. So I got this information actually from Sam Marcy. He actually wrote a lot of great articles at the time. He was one of the very few socialists who was at the time writing against what was going on. I saw several papers.
To give some context to people who Sam Marcy was.
Yeah.
He comes from a Trotskyist tradition, but actually he founded the WWP, and they called them the Maoist Trotskyites, which is pretty funny. But he supported existing socialism and anti-imperialism, like Gaddafi's socialist Libya and the DPRK and Cuba. They're very pro-Cuba and China and things like that. And they even supported the Soviet Union, which was why Marcy was not really in any sort of like pigeonhole that anyone could really get him into. He's a very interesting character and very smart guy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very interesting tradition to like come out of Trotskyism, I think. So yeah, based on like some of the information I found from one of his articles, so on January 3rd of 1990, the New York Times admitted that there was a debate if the revolution was spontaneous or if the spark of protest was fanned by a small conspiratorial group. It cites that a video was filmed on December 22nd of a meeting between members of the Council of National Salvation. And this is the government that would come into power after Ceausescu falls. And it would be pretty much immediate. Immediately, this group would come in. So in the video, somebody proposes to call the government the Democratic Front. Now, there's a general. His name is General Militaru. And General Militaru, a member of the then new government, he expresses his dissatisfaction and states that the name Council of National Salvation already, quote, has been functioning for 6 months, unquote. This was the first public acknowledgement that party members and the military had been working in coordination under the banner of Council of National Salvation as long as 6 months prior to the events that sparked off the revolution. So
well, there's no doubt in my mind that happened. If you want my reaction to it, there's no doubt in my mind. You can look at released CIA documents, which is probably why the Romanian courts are, getting MI6 documents and all these old documents from the Cold War are getting opened up, and Soviet documents as well, and that have been opening up and being found and released through all these years. And it's evidence. Of course, the United States has a massive network in the Eastern Bloc of intelligence trying to fan the flames and funding these groups. And how do you come out after just one day with a government, a court, everything organized, ready to go? It's obviously been months and months in advance. You don't have that shit set up after a day. If it was a pure spontaneous military coup, it would have been a collection of maybe a few politicians in general, but it would have been a small ring of it would have been a junta instead of a wider front. I mean, the military was involved, but it was obviously a broad conspiracy. There's no doubt in my mind.
And doesn't that just fly in the face of all of the Western propagandists who say that this was a spontaneous pro-democracy uprising?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the entire thing here is they want us to believe that this just kind of sparked up and the people rose up and created a democratic government. But as you said, Connor, I mean, this really isn't a surprise, but it is amazing to see it like captured on film and captured in the imperialist news that this is pretty much what was going on. So yeah, we talked about it a little bit before, but the government to come after this Council of National Salvation, it was composed of mostly military elements and people who were formerly in the Communist Party. One thing that I will say about the Romanian military, so a lot of countries who, well, I would say most countries who have built socialism have taken the premise that you tear down the bourgeois state. And normally that comes with destroying the military and building up some type of other organization. Well, Romania actually didn't do that. And this is actually very concerning given their past history with collaborating with the Nazis. So there was elements in the military that were still very sympathetic to those old years or still had that mindset maybe. So it was very interesting that they weren't one of the countries that got rid of their imperialist military to make way for like a workers military of some sort.
In my opinion, this is just sort of related but separate. The best way to handle a military in a socialist state is not to have a national military. Having a national militia, that's great, or something like that. But look at what China, the People's Liberation Army is not the National Army of China. It's the party's armed wing. So it's directly tied to the political line of the state. It's you can't remove them from each other. They are a part of the machinery. So and while in Romania it's this very independent, disparate, archaic relic of the past that was never reformed, well, that's not like the Red Army. That's not like the People's Polish Army or what happened in other places. It's not like what the DDR army did. That was very odd, very odd.
Yeah, and it shows why during the revolution or the counter-revolution, there would have been fighting between this military and the Securitate. And the Securitate is kind of like their attempt at having like a more ideological armed wing of the party. So yeah, it is very odd to see. But the last thing that we'll talk about here is I want to talk about the role of the media, because it was very important that this was being filmed and, pretty much proposed as being like, we can view all of what happened at that event. But there was a lot of misreporting that has now, like, it's just blatantly true. And they've even had to recognize it in a lot of areas. For example, there was a report going out that there was a massacre of school children at the Timișoara Cathedral. And the report went along the lines of there was children singing and protest outside of this cathedral, and the troops came in and brutally gunned them down. Well, fortunately for us, there was actually a bystander who happened to film the whole thing. And what you see is the school children standing there singing. You see a bunch of protesters, and tanks do come in. In the tanks, they basically chase off the protesters and the students flee. So there was no massacre of students. That was just a blatant lie. One of the most odd things that they did. So what they did is they were showing videos all over the Western media of just like bodies, just piles of bodies, like all lined up next to each other. And they were saying, these are the victims of the Securitate. These are Ceausescu's troops, and they've been gunning down these innocent protesters, and here are their bodies for you to see on camera. Well, it shows that the opposition definitely wasn't principled, because sure enough, what they were doing was they were digging up dead bodies of people who were buried in that week and just lining them up next to each other and saying, oh man, look at all these people who are dead. And in the videos, you can see that these people actually have like autopsy scars and like stitching from where they would have had an autopsy.
So wow. This is a parallel in 1989, because there was another attempted outside interfering counter-revolution in China. It really was just a small protest located in Beijing. It wasn't a national popular thing. It was a bunch of students who were funded by the National Endowment of Democracy, and they were told there's a massacre. There was a massacre at Tiananmen Square. There was no massacre at Tiananmen Square. There wasn't a massacre outside of Tiananmen Square. The only people who were killed that day were international students from Africa and South Asia who were hung and burned alive by these same counter-revolutionaries. So, I mean, and we're told to empathize with it every year. Tiananmen Square massacre. What are you talking about? These people were burning black people and South Asians alive. They were racist as hell, funded by the National Endowment of Democracy. And you can see these leaders of them on video. There's video of them giving interviews about saying how much they fucking hate Chinese people, their own people, how much they hate and look down on them and think they're subhuman. And it's like, wow, these are the freedom-fighting democracy figures that you're so purporting. It's just twisting by the Western media and narrative. And they did that even in the Eastern blocs through what you mentioned earlier, FBK, Radio Free Europe. And now there's a Radio Free Asia. You know, they're doing that same shit. People are learning about it. I mean, the anti-imperialist countries understand this and know how to combat it much better now. But, you know, at the time, it was a big convincing lie.
And that's why it's so important to learn about this stuff, because you can compare it to what's happening now today with places like Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and it's still occurring today, and the strategies really haven't changed all that much.
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair point. And that's a big reason of why I wanted to talk about this, because as I was learning about it, I kept thinking, okay, this paralyzed so much, you know, this is obviously the same playbook. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot we can learn. I did want to read a quote from it's a French media historian. His name is Christian Delporte. And he said, quote, "Media should be immune to large-scale manipulation such as timisoara. However, fierce competition and imitation in the media industry can always lead to mistakes," unquote. So there's actually countless quotes like this where, you know, the media is practically apologizing for their mishandling of reporting in Romania. I had to credit definitely French journalists. When I was looking this up, they seem to be the biggest group of journalists who recognized that something was wrong, and they put out a lot of recounts on this. So one last thing I want to talk about is the death count. Originally, I don't think we're too surprised that Radio Free Europe was promoting 60,000 dead. You know, we don't want to get too bogged down in like the death count kind of thing, but it is important to know by the best account that we have from different sources, even Romanian sources in the government today, they say that it's roughly between 1,000 and 1,800. But the interesting thing about this is that the majority of people who died actually occurred after Ceausescu was murdered, which would have been on Christmas. So there was like a period of 3 days where fighting was still intense. And that's where there's a lot of mystery. And it's just like, what the hell happened during that 3 days? Who was responsible for what? You know, there could have been various rogue elements of the military and such fighting each other. But it seems to be like that's where the most intense fighting actually occurred. And it wasn't really reported like that at the time, which is interesting. But just to finish and wrap all this up here, I mentioned it earlier that Romania is still trying to figure out what exactly happened. So it was actually in 2016 that the Romanian courts decided that they would look into this again. And it's gone through a back and forth process. They closed it down after a couple of years. They opened it back up in 2019. And it was actually so it was on like May 21st of this year. Unfortunately, they decided that they would close it again. They have a file, it's called the Revolution File or the Revolution Report, and they decided to send it back to the military. In this case, they've been naming specific people who are actually still a part of the government and saying and accusing them of helping orchestrate, and the words they use is fan the flames, which I think is fair. It implies that there was some aspect of spontaneity, maybe around the preacher and, these different places where it kicked off, but they definitely were ready to roll with a plan. So yeah, unfortunately, like I mentioned, Romania hasn't come to a conclusion on that, but it just shows how important it still is to them even today. So yeah, I just wondered if any of you comrades had any final comments, any like takeaways from like what we discussed today.
Yeah, I just think it's, as you said, it's important to look at these historical moments and understand what really happened, because these tactics are still going on today. The tactics of imperialists may have different, coats of paint, but it's always of the same nature. And that there are ways we can defend from it, because in 1989 and after the fall of the Soviets, look what countries survived that tumultuous period for socialism. And these are the ones that adapted to it. And these are the ones who understood how to handle disparate elements within their society not with violence, mind you. China, DPRK, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, they don't do it through violence. They do it through success. They do it for giving the people what they want. They do it for appealing to the sensibilities of the masses. They do it. They're vindicated by their success. And so that's why the people follow them. That's why they're popular. That's how they get rid of disparate elements. And what happened in Romania? They isolated themselves at first, and then played a darling to the West. Then they opened themselves up to IMF loans and stripped all social services through austerity for their people. So it was just handled in the wrong way, and we need to take lessons from this so it never happens again.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And like you said, it is interesting to see the different routes that the socialist countries at that time were taking to combat that problem. Like you mentioned, there's very direct ways of combating it. But then there's, like you said, the way like China and even the DPRK have taken to adapt to the times. So yeah, I definitely think there's a lot we can learn from the Romanian experience, as tragic as it was, because ultimately that is one of my takeaways. Is it is a story of tragedy because, as I mentioned earlier, they're forced into this weird situation where they think they have the USSR on their side. They start to notice contradictions, and it's just the route they choose is it's just so back and forth. It's just so here and there. And, it's just interesting to see them watch it like crumble down in real time. So yeah, there's definitely a lot that we can take away there. But before we get out of here, did you have any comments you wanted to make, Comrade Danke?
Yeah, it was all just very tragic to hear. And I feel like Comrade Connor pointed out very succinctly, like all of the problems. And it really is like a domino effect of failed policies that led towards this coup taking place. And, and it just goes to show that even if countries are organized and if they plan correctly, like China, they will still be the target of these propaganda campaigns and these coup attempts. I think it's here to stay, and it's something that socialist countries will have to deal with for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and one thing that I guess I'll end on is, I know, Connor, earlier you said the events in Tiananmen Square. A lot of us who have researched this, we probably realized that a lot of this information isn't really hidden. All you have to do is just know what to look up and just spend enough time with it to see that there's more to the story. You mentioned people being burned to death and such like that. There's actually pictures of this. You can see pictures of this on the internet. People strung up on buses, burned. So, it's one of those situations where calling out what happened is super important. Like, even as communists, if we think, okay, yeah, it's kind of obvious, we really should put out our message in a counter narrative. For example, I was trying to look up communists on YouTube who talked about what happened in Romania. I have to say, I think like last year, I did find somebody who had a video, It might still be up there. Maybe I couldn't find it, but besides that, I didn't see anybody else talking about it. That's not to like diss everybody or anything, but I'm just saying the fact that we care enough about this stuff and we're still challenging these narratives like all these years later, it really does blow some people's minds because they don't know that this evidence is like right there for them to see. So we definitely, take pride in contributing to that as in our little ways that we can. But on that note, I think that's where we're going to finish today. We definitely appreciate Comrade Connor for coming here and chatting with us. We definitely look forward to doing some more work together in the future, talking about historical events and such. So yeah, on that note, we'll head out. And thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
See you
Thank you.
next time.
Solidarity, y'all.